I am a lawyer in central Minnesota, and I am watching the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. I typically do a live show every weekday at 11 p.m. Central Time, 11 p.m. till about 2 a.m., including last night. So it is almost 9 in the morning. I had a nice short night, and we will continue on with Kyle's issues. And on this channel, we will be watching basically all of the trial that is findable, we'll say. I think that's the wording to use here. Findable.
Now, or
so
first he is entitled.
So given that jury instruction with respect to count 2 for this reckless endangerment,
and
so you and I both know that we have to apply the law as it's been given to us, regardless of what we think about the law personally. So given the law as it was just described to us in count 2, and given the evidence we currently understand, guilty or not guilty, because I don't know anymore.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Depends on the jurors' feelings, apparently.
I was asking you, what do you think?
Will show.
I think
August 25th, 2020.
I want to hear this guy.
Here in our community,
fair enough.
The defendant Kyle Rittenhouse, who was 17 years old at the time, had armed himself with an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle loaded with 30 rounds in the magazine.
Magazine clip.
And using that rifle, he shot and killed Joseph Rosenbaum, an unarmed man. The shot that killed Mr. Rosenbaum was a shot to the back. This occurred after the defendant chased down Mr. Rosenbaum and confronted him while wielding that AR-15.
Did it?
The evidence will show that the defendant fled the scene.
How did he chase him down?
The dead body of Joseph Rosenbaum without stopping to offer any aid whatsoever. And as he's running, word spreads from the crowd on the street that there is an active shooter running through the area. And the citizens there attempt to stop him. They approach the defendant. One person hits him in the back of the head. One person takes a swing at him with a skateboard. That individual is Anthony Huber.
He hit him with a skateboard.
Eventually, the defendant loses his balance and falls to the ground. An individual who is the subject of count number 2, the unknown individual, runs in at that point and attempts to kick the defendant in the face.
No, count number 3. You got this wrong. This
unknown individual is unarmed. The defendant, in response, points his AR-15 directly at this individual as this individual is literally flying over his body and discharges that gun twice. Luckily, that individual was not hit. But clearly, if he had been hit, the wound would have been severe and perhaps even fatal.
Flying over his body, he's kicking him in the face.
Immediately after that, Anthony Huber,
defense will get to say all this,
who is holding a skateboard, comes in and reaches for the defendant's gun. He grabs hold of the gun and tries to pull it away from the defendant.
Well, thanks.
The defendant is wearing his AR-15 strapped to his body. There is a nylon strap around his entire body, and the gun is slung from that. So it is essentially attached to him. Mr. Huber's efforts are unsuccessful because of that strap. And in that struggle, the gun winds up pointed directly at Mr. Huber's chest. The defendant pulls the trigger one time and discharges a round into Mr. Huber's chest, killing him instantly. A final individual by the name of Gage Grosskreutz has followed this chase on foot and has approached the defendant at this time. Mr. Grosskreutz is holding his cell phone that he'd been using to record the night's events for a live stream on Facebook in one hand, and a Glock semi-automatic pistol in the other hand. He runs up to the defendant. The defendant turns towards him with the AR-15. Mr. Grosskreutz raises his hand. The defendant then turns his rifle over, begins to examine it for a second. Mr. Grosskreutz takes this opportunity, and you will see in the
photo. Was it for even a second?
That he blades his body with his left hand, reaching towards the defendant. His right arm is pulled back. This is the one with the gun in his hand. And as he's reaching for the defendant turns the AR-15 and discharges the 8th and final round. into Mr. Grosskreuz's right arm. The arm
Just
with the
made
gun.
2 self-defense cases right
Mr.
there.
Grosskreuz runs off, screaming for a medic. The
I
defendant
don't mind it though, because he's admitting to bad facts, so he's taking the sting out, which is
he
good
killed
strategy.
2 unarmed people, shot at a third at very close range, and wounded Mr. Grosskreuz in the arm, who was armed with a gun.
And is now
It is the
disarmed.
state's position that this evidence demonstrates the criminal charges against the defendant is intentional homicide of Anthony Huber and his reckless conduct towards the other defendants. Now, what I've just given you is the snapshot, but there's a wider context here. As we all discussed yesterday, this occurs during the context of the events following the shooting of Jacob Blake, which occurred on Sunday night, August 23rd, 2020. And we all know that within a short period of time after that, the community erupted in protests, looting, rioting, arson, and violence. Sunday night and Monday night were 2 of the roughest nights that our community has ever seen. We are well aware of the damage that the uptown area along 22nd Avenue suffered. The probation and parole office on 60th Street, the furniture business there, Car Source, one of their locations on Sheridan, and other properties around town that were damaged.
I love
Fortunately, in the entire sequence of events, this was all property damage. And one of the things we all agreed on yesterday is life is more important than property.
Fair.
Up until Tuesday night,
Not always.
despite all of the things that the community had experienced, no one had been killed. But what happened as the time went on was that the people of Kenosha, who felt a sense of outrage, began to protest. But like moths to a flame, tourists from outside of our community were drawn to the chaos.
Oh, they're going
here
to
in
pull this
Kenosha.
one, huh?
I like it.
People from outside of Kenosha came in and contributed to that chaos. And it caused many of our citizens to fear for their safety, fear for their homes and their families, fear for their businesses, and take steps to protect themselves, whether it is to arm themselves, board up their windows, move, or take time away from the community. All of those reactions were entirely understandable and reasonable. And no one here is going to tell you otherwise. As long as those are what you're left doing, there's no issue. But out of the hundreds of people that came to Kenosha during that week, the hundreds of people that were out on the streets that week, the evidence will show that the only person who killed anyone was the defendant, Kyle Rittenhouse. The evidence will show that hundreds of people were out on the street experiencing chaos and violence, and the only person who killed anyone was the defendant, Kyle Rittenhouse. We will show you videos of some of the events that night, of police, tear gas, rubber bullets, and yet the only person who killed anyone was the defendant. There are fireworks going off, which is a loud noise, sounds like gunfire. There are guns being discharged, the sound of gunfire throughout our community that night. Hundreds of people are there experiencing this, and yet the only one who kills anyone is the defendant. We will show you video of hostile confrontation between literally hundreds of people on one side of the issue and on the other side of the issue. People getting up in each other's faces. And yet the only person who killed anyone.
Love it. I love the repetition.
He's making a good opening statement.
No, I think this opening is
the night of August
wonderful.
25th. Experience that chaos. Hundreds of people. And yet the only one who killed anyone is the defendant, Kyle Rittenhouse. Recently, I heard someone sort of tongue-in-cheek joke that jury service is bringing in folks from our community and paying them $8 a day to help solve a murder. We're not asking you to solve a mystery in this case. In most homicide cases, The elements that I need to prove might be a little challenging, but here, there's no doubt, there will be no dispute in this record that the defendant had that gun that night, shot 8 bullets, 4 of them hit Joseph Rosenbaum, 2 of them at an unknown individual, 1 into Anthony Huber's chest, and 1 into Gage Grosskreuz's arm.
Love it.
That will not be in dispute. The central issue in this case is going to be self-defense. And the judge has given you an instruction, which I want to highlight here, because there are some factors that I'd like you to keep in mind when you hear the evidence in this case. The defendant used deadly force. There is a privilege under our laws to use deadly force, but it's a very limited privilege. That privilege, according to the law, indicates that the defendant can only use deadly force if he reasonably believed that the force was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself. In determining whether or not those beliefs were reasonable, the standard is what a person of ordinary intelligence and prudence would have believed in the defendant's position under the circumstances that existed at the time of the offense. The reasonableness of the defendant's beliefs must be determined from the standpoint of the defendant at the time of his acts and not with the benefit of hindsight. You are essentially the people of ordinary intelligence and prudence who will apply that standard of reasonableness to the defendant's behavior and make a determination as to whether or not his use of deadly force was reasonable. Was it reasonable for the defendant to believe that the force was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself? So let's talk about the context of that evening. And I'm going to try and go in a little bit of chronological order to set things up for you so you understand the evidence as it comes into this trial. The first witness you're going to hear from in this trial is a man by the name of Dominic Black. Dominic Black was, at the time of this incident, dating Mackenzie Rittenhouse, who is the defendant's sister. And through Mackenzie, Dominic Black got to know the defendant. And they spent a lot of time together in the months leading up to August 25th, 2020. In fact, on May 1st of 2020, Dominic Black bought the AR-15 for the defendant. That occurred up in Ladysmith, Wisconsin. Dominic Black used money that was given to him by the defendant to go to an Ace Hardware up in Ladysmith and buy the gun in Dominic Black's name. Now you might ask, why was it necessary for Dominic Black to do that? Why couldn't the defendant do that? Because the defendant was 17. And Dominic Black and the defendant knew that because the defendant is 17, he cannot purchase a gun. He cannot legally own a gun.
That's not true.
And
No,
so this
but
was
the owning
in fact
part,
a
that's,
straw
you know.
purchase on behalf of Dominic Black, on behalf of the defendant. After the gun is purchased in Ladysmith, Dominic Black and the defendant spent a little time up there at Dominic Black's family's hunting property. And they fire both that AR-15 and one that Dominic Black already had. And the two of them are practicing using their AR-15s at a shooting range that they have on that property. And Mr. Black will tell you some more about that. Then they agreed that that gun would not go home with the defendant to his home in Antioch, Illinois. It would stay here in Kenosha at the residence of Dominic Black's stepfather in a locked gun case. And in fact, after the two of them returned from Ladysmith in early May of 2020, the gun stayed at that residence here in Kenosha until the day of August 25th, 2020.
Cathurga says, listening to this POS prosecutor's sophistry is
leading up to
pissing
August
me off.
25th, that Monday night, the defendant stayed over at Mr. Black's residence here in Kenosha. And the two of them decided on that next day, Tuesday, August 25th, that they would do something about what was going on in Kenosha. So at one point earlier in the day, they come down here. They work on cleaning up some graffiti on some buildings here downtown. Then they decide they want to come back later that night and protect a local business, a business called Car Source, which is located at 59th and Sheridan. Now, as I talked to you a little bit about yesterday, Car Source actually has 3 locations very close in this downtown area. One of them was on the east side of Sheridan Road at 58th and Sheridan.
East side?
either on Sunday or Monday night. I think it was on Monday night, August 24th. That entire property was pretty much destroyed. There were multiple cars in the parking lot that were set fire and completely burned out. The building itself was damaged as well. Right across the street from there is another car source location that also sold used cars. And some of those cars had been damaged on the night of Monday, August.
No, I like it, though, because he's getting in front.
On Tuesday, when the defendant and Mr. Black are out,
bad facts,
they encounter one of the owners of Car Source. And they talk to him about protecting their 59th Street location that night. And there's some discussion about that. In the afternoon, Mr. Black and the defendant go out to Jelinski's on Highway 31, Green Bay Road. And they acquire straps so that they can sling those guns around themselves when they come back to the downtown area that night. And eventually later that evening, they return. They meet up with some other folks that are interested in protecting Car Source. Originally, they start out at 63rd Street Car Source, which is the third and final Car Source location. But then they agree, we're going to go to the 59th Street, 59th and Sheridan location and protect that location to make sure no one damages the cars, no one damages the property. And I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that. Protecting that property is entirely lawful, totally understandable. And it's something that many people here in Kenosha did. And there's a group of people, including the defendant and Dominic Black, that take up positions at 59th Street. Some of them, like the defendant, are on the ground in the parking lot, where as people are walking by in the street, they're having interactions with
Can I make a joke about roof Koreans?
Dominic Black will testify.
Sure.
He took up a position on the roof. He did that because he didn't want to be on the ground, close to where other folks were, close to where potential issues might arise. He wanted to stay a little bit removed from all of that. Didn't want to get directly involved.
Fired down in the crowd? I guess that would be good.
You will hear and see videos of sequence of events going on around Kenosha that night. The evening begins with large-scale protests, large-scale, no other way to put it, rioting that's occurring.
Good for him.
Right outside these windows, right in front of the courthouse here at Civic Center Park. There is a crowd of police that have lined up to protect this building, to protect the public safety building, which is right next door. And there
you may not like what he's saying, but he's doing a very good job.
They are screaming at the police. They are throwing projectiles. Police are shooting rubber bullets, tear gas, etc. It is a very volatile situation at Civic Center Park. Now, that's at 56th and Sheridan, about 3 blocks north of the Car Source where the defendant was. But as the evening goes on, the police decide to move the line of protesters south on Sheridan. And eventually, they pass the Car Source at 59th and Sheridan. The police establish a line at 60th and Sheridan, 1 block south. Now, as that process is going on, many of these protesters pass by the defendant and the people that he's with at 59th Street. Words are exchanged. There is confrontation. There is a little bit of hostility. No one is hurt. No one fires a gun. No one is injured. But clearly there's antagonism. It is clear that this is a crowd that is not on the same side as the defendant, that does not see him as an ally, does not see him in his group as someone that they identify with. And as I said, there is a hostile exchange there for a while. In fact, at one point, members of the crowd pull one of the dumpsters from the property out into the street and attempt to start it on fire. And some of the other folks that are there with the defendant go out and put the fire out and have some very harsh interactions with those people in the street. I believe the evidence will show that it is this process that demonstrated for the defendant that this is a crowd that is not a safe crowd to be in. This is a crowd that does not view him as an ally. This is a crowd that if he ventures out into it, there could be problems.
That seems a little defense friendly,
now,
unless he's going to convert it.
Once the police pass by and the protesters are pushed down south of 60th, I believe the evidence will show that the Car Source that the defendant is stationed at is no longer in danger. There's no one there who's attempting to damage the property. There's no one there who's going to do anything to harm anyone there. situation has moved on. Does the defendant stay there? Does he decide that he's done what he set out to do and it's time to go home? No. The evidence will show that the defendant, another individual in the group by the name of Ryan Balch, who you will hear from, decide to venture out into the crowd. They cross the police line at 60th and Sheridan, and they walk amongst this group of hostile protesters. At some point, they both wind up at a gas station on the southeast corner of 60th and Sheridan called Ultimate Gas. And you'll see some video of the scene there. It is a scene, again, of groups of people that are clashing with one another verbally. There's some shoving going on. And in the midst of this is Joseph Rosenbaum. And you will hear some testimony about Mr. Rosenbaum and his activities that night. Mr. Rosenbaum had been discharged from the hospital that very day and had come back to his home of Kenosha, had met up with his girlfriend, Carrie Ann Swart. He couldn't stay with her, so he left her and came downtown and got caught up in the midst of these protests.
Got caught up.
You will see him on videos. You will see photographs of him as he's walking around. He is carrying a plastic bag. Part of that plastic bag is clear and see-through. It has a string, white string, drawstring to it. It is the type of bag, I believe the evidence will show, that you get at the hospital when you're asked to put all of your personal possessions in a bag. Your shoes, your watch, your phone, your jewelry, etc. That's the type of bag it is. And I believe the evidence will show that he was carrying it around most of that evening. And at various points, the evidence will show that Mr. Rosenbaum is agitating. He is getting in people's faces. He is using obscenities. He is essentially daring people to respond. In fact, at Ultimate Gas, I believe the evidence will show that he actually gets right up in the face of armed people who are similarly armed as the defendant, who have similar AR-15 type rifles on. And he is literally confronting them in their faces.
Mm-hmm.
None of those folks shoot him. They push him away. He's 5'3", by the way, 150 pounds. They push him away.
He just made the manlet argument.
No one appears to take him as a serious danger. The defendant is at the Ultimate Gas station during part of this. So is Ryan Balch. I believe Mr. Balch will testify that there was an understanding that when we cross south of 60th, we stay together. We try not to intervene in anything. But if we get separated, head back to 59th Street, where our original group is. Mr. Balch does. The defendant attempts to. He comes up to the police line. They won't let him pass. He says, I work at that business, and points to 59th Street. And again, they won't let him directly through the line. Now, I believe the evidence will show that he could have easily gone a block in either direction if he really wanted to go back, but he turns away from the police line, returns to the Ultimate Gas station. And a few minutes later, we see him on the video of a man by the name of Corey Elijah, who will testify very shortly here in this trial. Mr. Corey Elijah was one of these people out on the streets who was Facebook live streaming the events of that night. And he catches the defendant passing right in front of him with a fire extinguisher. The gun still slung around his body, strapped to his body. And Corey Elijah will testify, this caught his attention. What? Where's he going with this fire extinguisher? And so Corey Elijah decides to follow with his video, recording the entire way. And we will show you that video. You will see that as Corey Elijah leaves the Ultimate Gas station at 60th and Sheridan and heads south, he passes by the defendant, who by this point is walking, holding a fire extinguisher in his hand, all by himself. Corey Elijah, I don't think, registers that that's the person I originally saw, and he keeps on passing him. And as he continues, he passes by Joseph Rosenbaum, who at this point has taken his shirt off. He's got shorts on, and he's taken his shirt and kind of wrapped it around his head. And Mr. Rosenbaum is still carrying that plastic hospital bag and walking down Sheridan towards the 63rd Street car source. The defendant is behind him at some distance. As they get down to the 6200 into the 6300 block of Sheridan Road, that block on the west side of Sheridan has a house right at the corner of 62nd and Sheridan. And then on the south end of that block, the south half, is the car source lot. You will hear testimony from someone from the FBI who was up in a plane that night taking video, and we will show you the video. It is an infrared video, which means it picks up heat. This is at nighttime, so regular cameras, especially from an airplane, aren't going to be able to see everything. So the infrared helps us to see in the dark. The video picks up Mr. Rosenbaum. It is quite clear to see him because he is a white blob. Infrared picks up heat. He doesn't have his shirt on. So the cloth of a shirt would help conceal some of that heat, but when you don't have your shirt on, that heat radiates, and the infrared picks it up more clearly. So he's very easy to see in the video as a white dot. You see him running towards the 63rd car source. And behind him, running in the same direction, following him, is the defendant. As they get to the 63rd Street car source, there are some cars on the north side of that lot. Mr. Rosenbaum peels off behind those cars, and the defendant stops on the other side of those cars and turns towards Mr. Rosenbaum. Now, obviously, in an infrared video from a plane overhead, we don't know exactly what was going on at that very moment. We don't know what words were said. But what's clear is whatever that confrontation that was initiated by the defendant started, it caused Mr. Rosenbaum to come around the cars and start running after the defendant. The defendant drops the fire extinguisher right there and runs, carrying his AR-15. At some point during that foot pursuit, the defendant turns around, points the gun at Mr. Rosenbaum, who puts his hands up in the air. Now remember, he has got no shirt on. He's got his hands up in the air, almost like, what are you going to do? The defendant stops, pointing at Mr. Rosenbaum, continues to run. And right around this time, there is a gunshot from someone else, who we have identified by the name of Joshua Zeminski. This is an individual who's walking on the sidewalk, probably 30 feet away from where the defendant and Mr. Rosenbaum are running. Mr. Zeminski, for reasons only he can explain, decided to take his handgun and fire it one time in the air. As I said, this is in a different direction and many feet away from where the defendant was. Mr. Rosenbaum continues to pursue the defendant.
Why?
And we will have Detective Martin Howard testify that he's timed the gap between Mr. Zeminski's shot and the eventual gunshots is about 2.5 or 2.6 seconds. Mr. Rosenbaum closes on the defendant. The defendant turns and fires 4 shots at Mr. Rosenbaum. You will hear the testimony from the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner, Dr. Douglas Kelly, that Mr. Rosenbaum suffered 5 wounds total from 4 bullets. Dr. Kelly will testify that the first 2 wounds that were inflicted upon Mr. Rosenbaum were to his lower extremities. We're not sure which order they were in, but one was to his right pelvis, fracturing his pelvis, and one was to his left lower thigh. Dr. Kelly will testify that these wounds caused Mr. Rosenbaum to start falling face forward. And you will see video of his body where it is found. He lands on his face down on the ground. As he is falling, the defendant fires 2 more shots. One of them hits the defendant in the back, or I'm sorry, Mr. Rosenbaum in the back. And that is the shot that kills Mr. Rosenbaum, according to Dr. Kelly. You will hear testimony from someone by the name of Richie McGinnis. Richie McGinnis is a reporter who came to Kenosha to cover the events of that night. And at some point shortly before these shootings, he encounters the defendant at 59th Street and interviews him. He talks to the defendant and then follows the defendant down Sheridan Road and is right behind the defendant as these shootings are occurring. In fact, he is in the car source lot. He is behind Mr. Rosenbaum when Mr. Rosenbaum is shot. And Mr. McGinnis will testify that one of those rounds came close to him, which is the basis for the count that we've alleged that Mr. McGinnis was recklessly harmed or placed in danger by the defendant. Mr. McGinnis will testify that when he saw Joseph Rosenbaum shot and fall to the ground, he immediately ran up and attempted to treat Mr. Rosenbaum. He took off his shirt. He used it to try and stem some bleeding. He rolled Mr. Rosenbaum over onto his back and he's attempting to administer first aid. Many other people respond at that very moment to that location and attempt to help Mr. Rosenbaum. They eventually lift him up. They carry him across the street to Frederick South, formerly known as Kenosha Memorial Hospital, KMH, which happens to be right across the street. These folks load him into a hospital SUV that's there in the back of it, and it races off towards the emergency room to try and save Mr. Rosenbaum's life. That's what Mr. McGinnis does. The defendant, after shooting Mr. Rosenbaum, gets on his phone, calls Dominic Black and says, "I just shot somebody," and starts running away. Now, one of the things that you will see and hear in this case is that the defendant throughout this entire evening held himself out as an EMT, as a medic, that he's carrying a medical bag with him, strapped to his body. And yet in this time of Mr. Rosenbaum there on the ground, injured, potentially dying, the defendant offers no aid, but instead runs. He runs up Sheridan Road. He encounters another member of their group from 59th Street, who you will hear testify, by the name of Jason Lakowski. Jason Lakowski is similarly armed. He's a former Marine. He had been with the defendant at 59th Street and had come down in response to the gunshots. Mr. Lakowski will testify that he met Mr. Rittenhouse as the defendant was fleeing the scene. And Mr. Rittenhouse said to him, "I didn't shoot anybody, but I need help." And Mr. Lakowski says, "Head up towards the police." So the defendant starts running north on Sheridan. The crowd starts yelling, "That guy, the defendant, just shot somebody," because that's all the knowledge they have at that point. And it's true. So they begin to chase after him. They clearly believe he's an active shooter, and they try and stop him. And I've already described to you the events that follow. Mr. Huber, the unknown individual, and Mr. Grosskreutz. So when we talk in this trial about the nights of August 25th, we need to keep in mind the context of that night. We need to keep in mind the fact that there were hundreds of people on the street that night experiencing the same chaos, the same loud noises, the same gunfire, the same arson, the same tear gas, the same hostile confrontations with people who believe the opposite of them. And yet out of these hundreds of people, only one person killed anyone that night. Only one person shot anyone that night. When we consider the reasonableness of the defendant's actions, I ask you to keep that in mind. Now, in this trial, you are going to hear from a number of witnesses from the state. I've already told you about a few of them. We are going to begin the testimony with Dominic Black. He will tell you a little bit about the acquisition of those guns. You will hear from Corey Elijah,
Shouldn't Dominic
who was
Black
live
just plead
streaming
the fifth on that
night. You will hear from Detective Martin Howard, who worked diligently to gather evidence, including many different videos, many different photos of the scene that night. We are going to use that television to show you these things so that you can see them yourself. I know many of you alluded to the fact yesterday that you've watched or read things about this. You will get the full story here in the courtroom, and you will see some things that have not been made public yet. We intend to do that by moving the TV as central as we can so that you can see it as up close and as well as possible. And we will show you as much as we can about the events of that night. You will hear from the FBI individual who was in the plane taking that infrared video that shows the defendant chasing Mr. Rosenbaum and initiating that confrontation.
Fair.
You will hear from other individuals who took video that night. You will hear more about Joseph Rosenbaum from his girlfriend, Carrie Ann Swart. She will tell you about his hospital stay. She will tell you about that bag. She will tell you about what was in that bag. You will hear about Anthony Huber. You will hear that he was a skateboarder, that he lived for skateboarding, that he was at the skate park at Penoyer Park all the time, that he actually knew Jacob Blake personally, that he came out that night because he wanted to show support for his friend, Jacob Blake. You will hear what sort of person Anthony Huber was. You will hear from other witnesses who've been affected by that night.
Except that he
You will
was a
hear from
domestic
law
violence.
enforcement
You won't hear that
witnesses
one.
who did a lot of investigative work to assemble all of the evidence against the defendant in this case. And you will hear from Dr. Douglas Kelly, who will testify regarding the cause of death of Anthony Huber, the gunshot wound to the chest. And you will hear that the shot that killed Joseph Rosenbaum was a shot to the back. And based on all of that evidence, I think you will agree with me that the defendant is guilty of all of these charges. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Let's take about a 10-minute break. Please don't talk about the case during the break.
Wait. All right. Yeah. So for my money, and I sense the chat will disagree with this, but so be it. I thought the opening was about as good as you would expect. This is top notch. It's not 10 out of 10. It's not like, creating new levels of brilliance but it's at the highest level of like a normal professional. So yeah. I'd say this is 9 out of 10 in terms of an opening. Some minor points of criticism for me. It was a little long for my taste. I think some of the points could have been shortened or perhaps omitted. That being said, I did like the overall idea of presenting the full timeline and full story. So I like the concept, but perhaps it could have been shortened a little bit. I liked his pacing. I liked his timing. I liked how he didn't step over some major points. Like when he made like a really emphatic point, he would stop for, 3 or 4 seconds to let the point sit. And so that was really good. I just think overall it was well presented, well argued. His tonality, his pacing, his word choice was overall extremely, extremely good. I found it very persuasive. That doesn't, of course, mean that I'm saying that I think that ultimately Kyle Rittenhouse is guilty. So please don't misunderstand me. But I think he did a exceptional job for a prosecutor. I thought it was very, very good. What do you think, Nick?
I basically fully agree. I mean, as far as the prosecution in this case has a really rough set of facts to make this conviction. They know they do. They have the context of a riot. They have a context of chaos. He knows that he has the context of these guys pursuing Kyle, reaching for guns. I mean, he's not trying to mitigate that, and it's pretty interesting. Or he's not trying to ignore that. He's putting it in there. He's trying to mitigate it by getting out ahead of it. The fact that he has to stand there with a straight face and convincingly does so.
Oh yeah, I found him believable. I found him like he to me at least, he seemed like he believed everything he was saying.
Right. The fact that he has to with a straight face argue that Joseph Rosenbaum pursued Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle turned and did not shoot him. Rosenbaum puts his hands up, is like, oh, okay, and he backs up. And then a couple of seconds later has to admit that. And then some other guy shot into the air, and then Rosenbaum resumed pursuit of Kyle Rittenhouse. Like, he has to deal with that fact, and he does it really, really well at opening. Now, this stuff is going to, of course, keep coming through trial as the timeline is established, and particularly by the testimony of Dr. Black, because he's going to be the guy laying out the video timeline. One of the facts that he seems to be hinging this entire argument on is the predicate act of shooting Joseph Rosenbaum in the back. And I argued yesterday, I think convincingly so, that if whoever wins on Rosenbaum is going to win this case. Rosenbaum,
I think it's very likely.
Yeah, Rosenbaum is the hinge. And so
except for the confusing jury instruction on reckless endangerment, which God knows at this point, but carry on.
Right. But on the main murder charges and the Huber or the Grosskreutz assault charge, if you win on Rosenbaum, you're going to probably end up winning on the other two because it goes right to his state of mind, what he reasonably believes. The interesting thing is it doesn't matter what Rosenbaum, Huber, or Grosskreutz believe. The reasonableness of their actions are not on trial. He wants to maybe put that reasonableness in there to try and confuse the jury. I assume the defense is going to focus heavily on the fact that it's about what Kyle perceived, not what anybody else perceived.
This is part of this issue is exactly what you were experiencing in the chat yesterday. with the confusion from the chat. From Kyle Rittenhouse's side, people were confused about this aspect, that we kept saying, oh, Rosenbaum, I mean, some of these people might be valid in self-defense. They might have a valid self-defense claim.
Right.
And some people on our side, or Kyle Rittenhouse's side, were confused by this. It's like they seem to be under the impression that if these people have a valid self-defense claim, it must necessarily mean Rittenhouse doesn't, which isn't true. They can both.
Yep.
So people who support Kyle Rittenhouse are confused by this aspect. So sure, why not confuse the jury? Because some of them probably believe that too. If he can demonstrate that these people were reasonable in their actions, he can try to infer that's necessarily true. Rittenhouse isn't reasonable.
Right.
So that would allow the jury to get to a guilty verdict if they have that same issue. Smart.
The trick for the defense will be reiterating and explaining and emphasizing on the jury instructions that it's Kyle's state of mind that matters in all of this, that the other people's actions, their perceptions are not relevant to this.
How well do you think that's going? We couldn't convince our own chat, yesterday, Nick. How well do you think that's going to go?
We'll see. I don't know. Maybe Richards is a really good lawyer. We'll have to see what. Or do you? I'm curious to see if Richards or Sharifsi is going to take the opening statement.
I'll obviously rate it for itself. The only part. Okay, so I want to say a couple other things. I thought it was very good tactically for the prosecutor to admit to bad facts.
Yep.
It's called drawing the sting, is a phrase you often hear in law. When you have bad facts, it's very helpful to you to get them out in front, because the other side's going to bring them up. So you basically have two choices. Do I let the other side bring it up, or do I try to bring it up and try to create the initial impression that those facts, those are bad facts, but they don't really matter? I'm so confident in my case, I can admit to the bad facts and I still win. So it's generally true, and I think true here, that he is incredibly smart for making the defense's case for them, because many things he said will be things the defense will say. And that's kind of the point.
Yep.
He's trying to preempt that by I already said the same thing. I went first and it must be guilty. So, it's not like it's the first time you've heard this, not a surprise. So I thought that was very, very good. So, for people who don't understand why they're doing that, there's a very strong tactical consideration, and I think it's the right call. The only part of the argument that I thought overall was weak was the self-defense argument, because he correctly states the law of imminent danger to himself and others. Now, he tries to answer that by saying no one else shot anyone else that night. Therefore, Rittenhouse no one else, despite all the arson and rioting and blah, 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 no one else apparently feared for their life. Therefore, it must be true. Rittenhouse didn't fear for his life. I didn't really feel like he didn't really feel like he satisfactorily closed the self-defense. He mentioned it, but I didn't really feel like he fully converted it to the end. It's a bit of a weak argument for my point. He's trying to argue from implication that because everyone else didn't shoot anyone else, and because everyone else was in roughly the same position, that Rittenhouse in his specific situation is not reasonable. And it's a little weak, but I don't know he could have done any better. So I'm still sticking with 9 out of 10.
Yeah, no, again, it doesn't mean that that they're going to win the case. It doesn't mean that it's the most convincing thing ever. It just means he did the job that he should do. And as a defense attorney, you would not want that guy. Don't want that guy giving opening arguments. You want pretty much any other prosecutor.
Fat ass would be good.
Yeah, because that guy seems just inherently unlikable. Right? Like, just from his posture and overall demeanor, he's less charismatic, he's less likable, and he seems offensive and affrontive even. But no, Binger did a very good job. And you have to give credit where it's due, because it's a consideration that the jury is going to take in. Now we'll see how the defense does, and
see if they can meet the challenge.
Hopefully they're going to make some very compelling arguments. I mean, he talked a lot about shooting in the back, which was a tactical choice. The context of that shooting in the back is what the defense has to show. And what Dr. Black's testimony why it's so important. The space between the shots that Kyle fires, it's bam, bam, bam. That's it.
Yeah.
Bam, bam, bam. No,
Close enough.
Bam, bam, bam. It's so fast. It's like a quarter second or less between each shot. So Rosenbaum is falling forward, and the shot that hits him in the back comes in at a downward angle. I mean, it's not like Kyle Rosenbaum was turning around to flee and he shoots him.
Fair enough. But, you know, then, of course, you can properly say he was shot in the back. Now, why that's true, I'm not going to necessarily mention right now, but it is technically true. And here's why from a ballistic standpoint.
He kind of does. He kind of did. Very. I mean, he was falling, so I mean that's why it went in his back. But he was shot in the back, and we don't. Yeah, I mean, that's a coward's shot right there. Is shooting a man in the back.
I think you know the chat is going to is calling him a liar and all the rest of it. And again, the chat's going to disagree with it. But I, for my money, didn't see anything he said was a lie. Everything he said, to my money, was a. Go ahead.
No, there was something early on. I commented on it. He lied about something. I don't remember what it was. It was very early in the argument, though.
Okay, yeah. Well, maybe with the one exception, if we ever get back to it, we can discuss that specific thing. But everything he said is a colorable interpretation of the facts. So, I thought it was about as good as can be done.
And
you would do well to study this as an advocate.
Absolutely. And to be clear to the chat, in case some people are confused, you typically don't object during opening arguments. It's very bad form.
It's very bad. And same thing for closing arguments. Objection is like,
unless the act is extremely egregious, like they make a highly prejudicial statement that has no foundation, will not be shown, or was specifically excluded in a prior motion. That's the only time you're going to get to object during opening arguments. The defense's objections, so to speak, will come when they lay out their narrative next. And so I just want, because I know some people are like, why isn't the defense doing something? That's why, because if you did, objecting during opening arguments can be a very negative thing from the judge and from the jury.
You know, the chat is suggesting that calling it a straw purchase might be a lie. In terms of
Leon's law,
in terms of its more legal sense, probably, but in terms of a more colloquial sense, that might be something that is a little bit touching the line. But
the lie was him saying Kyle could not own the gun, which is not true.
That I did know. That it's like he came. Well, I'm not sure about that one. So that might have been he misspoke or maybe something. But it's like that one does seem to be a bit of a problem. But I'm not gonna harangue the man for one sentence.
No.
In an otherwise brilliant opening, because I'm pretty sure the defense is going to make some mistake somewhere.
This is my opportunity to tell you and show you what I believe the evidence will show. You've heard the state's opening statement, and now I will give mine. We have two very different outlooks on the events of August 25th of 2020. Kyle Rittenhouse was present in Kenosha, Wisconsin on the evening of August 24th. He stayed at his friend's residence, Dominic Black. He saw on the live streams and things like that the events of the 24th. He saw car source number one, as I refer to it, the one that's on the east side of Sheridan Road, burn, all of the automobiles burned, destroyed. He saw the looting going on. He saw the other businesses burnt down. And the next morning, he went down to downtown Kenosha to look at the damage. He stopped and he helped clean up at the old Ruther High School. I think it's called something else now, but when I was around here, it was called Ruther, and before that, Bradford. And he saw that. He met one of the owners from CarSource, and they talked, and they decided that they would offer their services, him and Dominic Black and Nick Smith, to help protect the property of CarSource. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show, in spite of what the media and public statements and things like that have been, the evidence will show that Kyle Rittenhouse had strong ties to Kenosha. His father lived in Kenosha. His mother lived in Antioch, Illinois. Kyle worked here in Kenosha County at the Recplex in Pleasant Prairie as a lifeguard. He went downtown to clean up the graffiti. Him and Nick left there, and they decided to come back that evening and help CarSource Lot 2, which is at 59th and Sheridan, and initially CarSource 3 at 60th and Sheridan. And when they were doing that, they met other individuals who had come to town at the urging of websites and things like that, and then just a general, I would say, distaste for the destruction. And those guys from the West Bend area, Ryan Balch, Lukowski, Joanne Fiedler, agreed that they would all help protect the CarSource lots. And initially, they went to the lot.
Please stop starting your sentences
early in the evening. And what will end up
He does it
being,
immediately.
you will see the events of that night unfold in video and still photographs. But ultimately, what this case will come down to, it isn't a whodunit, when did it happen, or anything like that. It is, was Kyle Rittenhouse's actions privileged under the law of self-defense? That is, that the defendant believed that there was an actual or imminent unlawful interference with his person. The defendant believed that the amount of force which he used or threatened to use.
What happened to the other guy we saw yesterday? He's still at the council table. He was better.
The interference, and that his belief was reasonable. You as jurors will end up looking at it from the standpoint of a 17-year-old under the circumstances as they existed on August 25th of 2020. And Mr. Binger makes a big thing out of Kyle Rittenhouse was the only person who shot somebody that evening. True. Mr. Rittenhouse was the only person who was chased by Joseph Rosenbaum that evening. This is Joseph Rosenbaum. And what's important in this photograph,
as unbearable
is,
as this guy sounds, you got to remember he sounds like a
identify him
Wisconsin.
throughout the course of trial.
And these people
Notice
all
the
live
belt,
in Wisconsin.
The baggy, lengthy jeans, and there will be a fair amount of testimony, I'm sure, regarding the maroon shirt. He's obviously currently wearing it. Mr. Rosenbaum was at a location, and Mr. Rosenbaum had, along with other individuals, started a dumpster on fire. And when somebody put that dumpster that was very close to a gas station out, Mr. Rosenbaum became enraged.
If you could see the video. Was that Colin Kaepernick in the video?
Does it sound on?
I just saw a giant afro.
That's just a brief snippet of that.
They got the shoot me
interaction.
N-words in there.
And he was upset, and he's yelling that he wants to be shot. And you'll see individuals in the full video, which you'll see in the course of the trial.
I'm going to start making a note every time he starts
holding him back, trying
You don't have enough
to
paper.
stop him from getting at an individual who is dressed with a baseball cap, an AR rifle, and long pants. Excuse me, short pants. Who looks very much like Kyle Rittenhouse. Here's Mr. Rosenbaum during the evening. Him and his friend or associate, Joshua Zeminski, had just come from starting a trailer on fire. He arms himself with a chain and goes up and down Sheridan Road. carrying this rather heavy chain used to tie down equipment.
There's 4 minutes left to be at
Next
10
is a
minutes.
still photograph taken from the Ultimate gas station where he was shouting, "Shoot me, nigger, shoot me, nigger," at a Black Lives rally. Who is that behind him? Joshua Zeminski. The evidence will show
Demonetization.
that Mr. Zeminski, also named as Alec Blaine, and Mr. Rosenbaum are together.
He dropped the
throughout
hard
the evening.
R.
Joshua Zeminski plays a central role in this scenario on August 25th. One, creating chaos and havoc with Mr. Rosenbaum. And two, more importantly, when we finally get to car source number 3, Mr. Zeminski is the individual who fires the first shot that evening behind Kyle Rittenhouse as he's being chased by Mr. Rosenbaum. Here's a picture with 2 circles. Mr. Rosenbaum and Mr. Zeminski starting the trailer on fire on Sheridan Road along with the dumpster. You see the photograph, the second one circled. Testimony will show that that is in fact Mr. Rosenbaum wearing a blue mask, not his shirt over his head, and carrying a bag, which I'm sure there will be much testimony about. Other individuals
Sorry, he's
in
salty as
this,
hell.
once again, Mr. Zeminski. In the photograph taken at the Ultimate, this is a still from one of the videos you'll get to see, is Mr. Zeminski armed with the weapon that he ultimately fires at the car source 3. The individual with the red hair is Kelly Zeminski. She has a backpack and there's a circle on her hand with a big, heavy flashlight. As you can see, there was no need that evening for a flashlight other than it being a weapon. Count 2 is an individual by the name of Richard McGinnis. He was a reporter.
No need for a flashlight at night.
Covering the riots in Kenosha. He had covered the riots in Portland, Minneapolis. And he will tell you what he's called to the witness stand by either the state or myself, that he was dressed like this that night. The black t-shirt with the white back, the helmet on his head. And he had interviewed Kyle Rittenhouse and talked to him. And Mr. Balch and Rittenhouse were going to go out and see if anybody needed medical attention that evening. And Richie McGinnis was going to follow along. He will testify that he goes out with them and eventually they have an interaction with the individual who we refer to as Yellow Pants Man. This is Gage Grosskreutz, the individual who is the victim, or excuse me, the complaining witness in count 5. I apologize. And in that photograph, you see that he's wearing a backpack and he has a cell phone in his hand as he does throughout the evening filming. Photograph 10, excuse me, the next photograph, is the evidence will show Gage Grosskreutz running down Sheridan Road, and you see his hand going into the back of his waistband, pulling out a firearm to arm himself. The evidence will show through testimony of an individual by the name of Nathan DeBrune that that yellow dot right up there is where Kyle Rittenhouse
You mentioned the word victim, which I missed, but apparently
down Sheridan Road. Mr. Grosskreutz is not in any danger. Kyle Rittenhouse has already told him that he's going to turn himself into the police, yet he arms and continues with the mob to attack. This is a picture of Anthony Huber, the individual who attacks my client as he's laying on the ground after being kicked in the head by Jump Kick Man with his skateboard. He's hit him with the skateboard as he was running down Sheridan Road, and then as he's laying prone on the ground, he comes in for another hit on his head and then grabs Kyle Rittenhouse's firearm to try and take it away from him.
I think Jump Camp Man is one of the most brilliant things the defense has done so far.
To look at the whole skateboard, the size of that skateboard, the trucks of that skateboard. Ladies and gentlemen, I would love to be able to hold up that skateboard in front of you as evidence today, because then you could see it. You could see the weight and the heft of what a skateboard is. And what that skateboard would do is somebody takes it in their hand and swings down on somebody's shoulder, head, and neck, trying to separate the head from the body, as Mr. Huber did.
He's trying to decapitate?
Here, Your Honor, this is straying beyond a characterization of the evidence, and it's Mr. Richard's interpretation. It's an argument.
You'll see the photographs.
What a fucking dick.
You'll see the videos, and ultimately, you'll.
Why doesn't he have the skateboard? He said, "I'd love to show it to you." Why don't they have it?
Trying to do. The skateboard doesn't exist because Ms. Giddings, his girlfriend, in spite of repeated requests by Detective Howard, refused to produce it. That's what the evidence will show.
Warrants, my
Mr.
friend?
Huber at the Ultimate Gas holding back.
Yeah, that objection was
Rosenbaum,
overruled, but
who is ultimately
objecting it all was
the
bullshit to
individual
me.
who lit the fuse that night. Man I refer to as jump kick man or the non-complaining witness. Kyle is laying on the ground after being knocked to the ground by an individual hitting the head with a rock, Anthony Huber hitting him with the skateboard, and Jump Kick Man comes in, kicks him square in the face with his black boot. Close-ups of that. And as he's kicking him in the face, Kyle fires 2 shots at that individual. He's not hit. He gets up and he runs away into the night, never to be seen again, never coming forward to identify himself as a victim, complaining witness or otherwise to law enforcement. We looked for him, the evidence will show. The state looked for him, the evidence will show. Those are the big players in this case. But ultimately, what you'll end up having to decide, looking at all the circumstances of that evening, are the events that occurred over really a brief 15-minute period, but more importantly, 3 minutes. The police spread or push people south to approximately 60th. That's something we can agree. There's no line set up to stop Kyle or anybody else going in a southerly direction down Sheridan Road. There's no statement that if you go in that direction, you can't come back if you have business in that direction. Kyle.
Bring it to the podium.
An individual by the name of Ryan Balch, followed by Richard McGinnis.
Well, maybe you can't.
Go down there, Sheridan Road. And at 11:40, they have a conversation yelling medic. And you'll see the videotape of this event. Kyle's got his medical bag, his gun, and he comes upon these 3 individuals. And the individual in the yellow pants accuses Kyle Rittenhouse of pointing a laser sight from a gun at him. Kyle shrugs it off, does not want confrontation with these individuals, does not point his firearm at them, and he leaves. Why does he leave? Because he doesn't want trouble. These are the 3 individuals who were with Yellow Pants. One individual is carrying a noose. I don't know what that's for. The other individual, the testimony will be from Kyle Rittenhouse and Richie McGinnis.
Wait, Kyle's going to testify?
And then the blue-shirted individual was carrying a 9mm firearm.
Is that what he said?
Richard McGinnis will tell you about the marauding nature of these individuals. He was so intimidated by them after Kyle walked away that he had to give up 2 White Claws to him to settle him down and some cigarettes so that he would be
What the fuck are we talking about?
Kyle, from there, realizes he's been separated from Mr.
Calm down,
Balch.
have some White Claws.
He goes over to the Ultimate Gas Station looking for Mr. Balch and is unable to find him. What happens next is he attempts to get back to Car Source at 59th and Sheridan Road.
We're 4 minutes
Kyle
from
on the
20
right
minutes.
coming into the frame.
But Binger's is about 15 minutes, I think.
It was a very different experience living those two speeches.
I work in that business. I am at that business.
They don't let him pass. He goes back to the ultimate gas station, and a few minutes later, at approximately 11:45, he receives a phone call from Dominic Black. Dominic Black informs him, the evidence will show, that they're breaking windows and starting fires down at Car Source 3. Go and stop them. He asks an individual for a fire extinguisher and asks the individual to go down to Car Source 3 with him. The individual gives him the fire extinguisher, but does not go with him. And Kyle heads down to Car Source 3.
So
he doesn't know
to go. That's
that Mr. Rosenbaum is down there. He's been asked to go down there by Nick Smith. He heads down Sheridan from 60th, walking to Sheridan and 63rd, where the Car Source is. That's a picture of him from a video leaving the Car Source at 11:46 p.m. approximately. He has his firearm, and he has, as you can see in his other hand, a fire extinguisher to put out the fires and that are being started down there. This is an aerial photograph that the state had referred to in its opening, and it's actually started to roll, and you'll see circles in here. There's Kelly Zeminski in the green lettering, and that's a thermal image. Excuse me. I don't think I can start it. It starts very slowly.
This is the problem with tech.
You can see people are labeled Richie McGinnis, and they head down.
Oh, this is the thermal imaging from the FBI.
Which we can't see, which is lame.
You see Mr. Rosenbaum come around. I'm hiding in the cars, beginning to chase my client. You'll see the flash of the firearm from Mr. Zabitsky.
Oh, thank God.
Oh, thank
You'll see
you.
the flashes of his first shots.
Not focused at all.
I'm not responsible for cutting this video. I don't know how it got the way it did chopped up. That's the FBI up in the plane that took this video. But it's very telling.
The FBI delivered an edited video?
Times. I'm not going to go through it again for you in opening. But you'll see it, that the individuals are heading down Sheridan Road, and you'll see this.
They should have just objected to this video.
It's now over here. Go.
Sure they did.
Right in this location. You'll see Kyle come into this area and pause where Mr. and Mrs. Zeminski are. And you'll see in this car is a fire that's starting. See
Move your head.
Move, Finger.
Kyle runs in this direction, trying to get away from Mr.
Well, I'll look at this one instead.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kyle Rittenhouse is under no obligation whatsoever to retreat from Mr. Rosenbaum. He does. He runs away from him because he doesn't want a confrontation. He doesn't.
I can't see shit in this still.
Which makes no sense.
Good, because the jury can't
What the state
either.
says about him hunting.
If that's
or
their big
chasing
evidence, that's
him down.
actually probably great.
He's trying to get away from the individual. You'll hear testimony, not just from Kyle Rittenhouse, but Balch, Mr. Balch, about Joseph Rosenbaum.
I want to take a bet on the probability the
Kyle
cameraman shows the jury at some point.
And to Ryan Balch in each other's presence. If I get either of you two alone, I'm going to kill you. Flat out threats to murder. When Mr. Rosenbaum is shot in the Car Source Lot 3, there's been a gunshot behind Kyle. He turns to address Mr. Rosenbaum of his firearm. Mr. Rosenbaum is not deterred, he continues to run. You'll see that on numerous videos, closing the distance. Mr. Rosenbaum could have stopped at any time. Mr. Rosenbaum is wearing that maroon shirt on his face as a mask, covering up his identity because he wants to steal my client's firearm and use it against him to carry out the threat he had made earlier. That isn't just the word of Kyle Rittenhouse made up after the fact. You'll hear the testimony of Richie McGinnis, who was close that evening. He was following behind them. You'll see him on the video. He'll testify to you in court. He did not feel endangered. He was doing his job. He will testify that Joseph Rosenbaum let out, as he put it, one of the scariest screams I ever heard, yelling, "Fuck you," and dove for Kyle Rittenhouse's gun. Kyle Rittenhouse fires. He fires 4 shots at Joseph Rosenbaum. The state wishes to slow everything down into a microsecond. Those 4
Weird
shots,
phrasing.
the evidence will show, took 0.76 of a second, 76 hundredths of a second from first shot to last shot. Those shots will be those measurements will be put forth by Dr. John Black, who's a certified video examiner. He breaks every frame down. He knows how much each frame takes.
Mm-hmm.
He counts the frames and he comes up with that time.
I think that was a
Next
little
photograph.
unnecessary. Just could have stopped at
11:48.
0.76 seconds.
That's car source 3. You see an individual right here with his hand in the air. The evidence will show that's Mr. Zeminski. This is Mr. Rosenbaum in full stride running after Kyle Rittenhouse. This is a still from a video. And you'll see a lot of videos leading up to this. You'll see a video, I believe it's from Corey Elijah, where he's confronted by Mr. Rosenbaum. And he doesn't want a confrontation. And he goes, you'll hear it on the video. The video is not showing that confrontation, but you hear Kyle's voice. And he goes, friendly, friendly, friendly. He thinks because he's giving medical attention and helping people out, that people don't have an animosity against him. He's wrong, but that's the belief in his head, and Mr. Rosenbaum chases after him. And I believe
Sounds like
that
Kyle's going to be
state will
testifying
want
directly to
say,
his state of
why
mind. I don't
did
know
he
if I
go
agree
down
with
there?
that.
He went down there because Nick Smith asked him to. Why didn't he keep running? 1, you don't have to run, but 2, I'll show you a video from 63rd looking back onto the car source lot, taken by an individual who will testify and his daughter. Next
How do you
photograph,
make showing the video
circled
boring?
again.
That's what I want to know.
Zeminski with the arm up, Rosenbaum in full stride chasing, and an arrow pointing to Kyle. This is the video from 63rd and Sheridan Road.
Oh shit. They shooting. Oh shit. Oh my god. I am.
Why
You'll
did you
see
put
that whole video during the trial.
What
That
does
was
that video
pointless.
show?
Individuals
What does that
ran
video
cars
show?
first, the
Video
rioters
shows nothing.
destroying all of those vehicles. And as Kyle was running from Mr. Rosenbaum, he did not want to run
Maybe we
into
weren't
those
paying attention to
rioters
them
who were
bashing windows or something.
destroying all of that property that did not belong.
Should have highlighted
But
that
even if
before
people in the
showing
crowd
video.
The
were,
first gunshot, the evidence will show Mr. Zeminski. You hear 4 shots in quick succession. The evidence will show that is Kyle firing at Mr. Rosenbaum as he's trying to take Kyle's weapon from him to use against him. You hear 3 more shots in quick succession. I don't think the government will have any dispute. I don't think the evidence will dispute. Those 3 shots are from another person who's in the car source lot firing for some reason. He was never identified, never arrested. This will show Kyle running back to the scene of the shooting. And it will show, I think the evidence will show, why Kyle Rittenhouse didn't stay and render aid for Mr. Rosenbaum. Not that he's under any obligation to do that, but sometimes discretion is the better part of valor.
He fucking shot him! Get in there! He fucking shot him! He fucking shot him! He fucking shot him!
Take screenshots.
how is that helpful to the defense?
That dude shot him.
Showing why
That
he's,
nigga just shot that dude.
why he's running.
Cranium that
Okay.
bullet.
Cranium that dude. He just
Individuals
shot
are
him.
yelling, he just shot him, shoot him, and you can see one of them with a gun, Mr. and Mrs. Zeminski. He begins running down Sheridan Road. He's not taking his gun. He's not threatening anyone as he's running down Sheridan Road. He's running in a southerly, I always get my directions confused, a northerly direction from 63rd towards 60th. What is at 60th? The evidence will show that is where law enforcement is, and that's where somebody would run to be protected from a mob that wants to kill him. The evidence will show this next video taken from Gage Groskowitz.
I think we're coming up on
He
40
runs
minutes
up
here.
to Kyle. At this point, he is unarmed. Kyle does not point a firearm at him, does not do anything to dissuade him from approaching him. You'll hear on the video the exchange, and you'll see it.
Hey, what are you doing? You shot somebody? Who shot? Who shot? Hey, stop him!
You see him running with the gun at the ground away from Mr. Groskowitz. Mr. Groskowitz came up on Kyle, got very close. Did Kyle point a firearm at him? Did Kyle shoot at him? No. All he wanted to do was get to the police. But the mob is closing in, of which Mr. Groskowitz is a member. The first individual runs up behind Kyle and hits him in the head with his hand or a hand with a rock in it. This yellow circle shows Kyle being knocked a bit askew. More importantly, his hat being knocked off. He's run all this distance. His hat stayed on his head. The government doesn't want anyone to think that he's being attacked or hit. This still photograph shows that his hat is being knocked off. That's the first blow to Mr. Rittenhouse. He continues to run. The testimony will show that these individuals are running up on him. What's important in this photograph, the evidence will show, is on the left, the testimony will be Mr. Huber is picking up his skateboard. Why is his skateboard on the ground? Because he has taken his skateboard and swung it at Kyle Rittenhouse's head for the first time, hitting him in the head. And you can see in the blue circle, Kyle Rittenhouse beginning to fall down. The 2 red marks are, one, the individual who struck him first, and Jump Kick Man closing in. Kyle goes to the ground. This is a still photo from a video you'll see. What's important here, the evidence will show, it's an individual. Kyle's on the ground within 2 feet. Kyle points the firearm at him, does not fire. The individual backs up. He's no longer a threat. Kyle does not discharge his firearm. The next picture. The unidentified complaining witness, jump kick man, kicking Kyle in the face. Behind jump kick man is
Who jump
Huber.
kicks with their hands in their
Now he's
crotch
picked
like
up
that?
his
It's very
skateboard.
weird.
This is a photograph from a different angle, a different individual. And you see him running in Kyle's direction. There's the boot right before contact. Those are the boots that struck Kyle Rittenhouse in the face. Here is the photograph. Mr. Huber's bare hand on the skateboard, holding the trucks, bringing it into contact with the back of Kyle Rittenhouse's
Don't
head.
call them trucks.
Jump kick man still has not even gotten completely on the ground. And where is Mr. Huber's hand? And it's important here, ladies and gentlemen, it's a bare hand grabbing his gun. The state will produce evidence, I believe, that there's no DNA on the gun. He must not have touched it. Ladies and gentlemen, there's video photographic evidence of him touching the gun. Next, the bare hand pulling the gun towards him.
Oh,
Jump
damn,
kick
that's
man
a good
getting up
angle.
to run away. You can see a close-up, the bare hand on the gun. Kyle Rittenhouse flat on his back in the most vulnerable position one can be in. There, the strap is pulled tight.
That's about as
Mr.
self-defensey
Huber's
as you
trying to
can
pull
get,
the
in all
gun away
honesty.
from Kyle Rittenhouse as he's laying flat on his back. Kyle's afraid he's going to be disarmed and shot with his own weapon. The evidence will show he fires one shot, striking Mr. Huber. In this photograph, just entering from the right, the evidence will show is Gage Grosskreutz. One hand, a phone, one hand, a firearm. Here's Gage Grosskreutz with his hands up. Kyle Rittenhouse does not fire. Look at the distance between them. Huber's skateboard has not even hit the ground yet. That's how fast all these things occur. Mr. Grosskreutz does not stay in that position or back up. He moves in on Kyle, getting closer, pointing the gun almost directly at his head. As the state said, he's like this, but look at where the gun is going. The gun is in a circle. It hasn't got directly to pointing at Kyle's head, but it's going there. Kyle fires once, hitting him. Another individual approaches after Gage Grosskreutz has been shot, puts his hands up. Kyle Rittenhouse does nothing. In that in event number 2, the whole event from first shot with Mr. Grosskreutz, jump kick man coming in and getting the 2 shots to the time Gage Grosskreutz is shot in the arm is about 5 seconds. You'll have exact times of those shots, how fast it occurs. And after the shooting that evening, Mr. Grosskreutz was interviewed.
Oh.
He told law enforcement his story of that evening.
Is he going to say what he said?
One interesting detail he forgot to mention was that he was armed when he got shot. He told the police that he had lost his gun as he was running down Sheridan Avenue. He didn't know that there were people out there like him videotaping and photographing everything. He had a gun in his hand, and that's why he shot. His statement says that the reason he went into the fray was because he had to stop Anthony Huber from beating Kyle with the skateboard. At 11:51,
Really?
Kyle has gotten up. There are individuals around
Why is that
or
a defense?
in that area who've come at him. He's pointed his firearm, backed them off, and he continues in a northerly direction down Sheridan Road to 60th.
He just shot them. Hey, dude right here just shot them. Dude right here just shot all of them down there. That dude just shot them up there. That dude right here. Yeah.
You see Kyle with his hands up approach the police car to turn himself in. The evidence will show that the police told him to get away from the car and go home. The police say that they pepper sprayed Kyle. Kyle didn't get hit with the pepper spray. He's not disputing that they might have shot pepper spray at him. That's why he backed up so quickly. He finally makes his way to car source 2 back at 59th, meets up with Dominic Black,
Finger's
the
gotta be
individual who sent
seething
him
at how
down to
long
car
this is
source
right
3,
now.
tells him about what had happened. Dominic Black, I believe, will testify that he saw him. He was white as a ghost, sweating like a pig, and he was explaining what happened, saying he had to do it. It was self-defense. They talk about going home to Antioch. Dominic Black takes him home. They leave about 10 to 12, and at 1:20, Kyle Rittenhouse and his mother are walking into the Antioch Police Department, turning themselves in to the police, which is what he wanted to do here in Kenosha. But the way Kenosha was that night, with the police department surrounded by fence and things like that, he couldn't. He turned himself into law enforcement. He said from that day what he did. He's made no bones about that. He acted in self-defense, ladies and gentlemen. The evidence will show that his actions on August 25th of 2020 were reasonable under the circumstances as they existed that night, being attacked by Mr. Rosenbaum. The evidence will show, and the law is clear, he didn't endanger those other individuals. The government can refer to him all they wish as an active shooter. The only person he had shot was Joseph Rosenbaum, who had made threats to kill, had made numerous statements about ripping people's hearts out. He wasn't afraid to go back to jail. And Nathan DeBroom will testify to some of the actions of Mr. Rosenbaum that night. And he'll testify, and it was one of the more telling statements, I thought, in a statement.
He just got the back to
If
jail
there was
in
trouble that night, Joseph Rosenbaum was there. And that's ultimately who visited himself upon Kyle Rittenhouse. The evidence will show he thought probably that he could get that gun from Kyle Rittenhouse. He was wrong. Kyle Rittenhouse protected himself, protected his firearm so it couldn't be taken, used against him or other people from Mr. Rosenbaum who'd made threats to kill. And the other individuals who didn't see that shooting attacked him in the street like an animal. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what the evidence will show. Thank you.
Woo! 40 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
Good prediction, man.
Let's break for
Why don't
lunch.
you go first this time?
Way too long. Way too long. It took him almost 20 minutes to get to the meat of his opening statement. What he should do is he should go back and reconsider and edit out that first 20 minutes, because his last 20 minutes was pretty good because of some of the photos and the video and his statements. I think this is the risk with using tech in making these opening statements. It becomes a crutch, and you can use it way too long, way too much. You can include stuff that isn't really useful. One of the videos is supposed to show us that these people are breaking windows. You can't tell it. And he says afterwards, oh, that's what it showed. These are breaking windows. It's like, Well, but I didn't see that when I watched the video. You told me after that's what I was supposed to see. That stuff was a mess. So the 41 exhibits or pictures, they weren't exhibits yet. The 41 pictures and videos, too much. But the some of his stuff about Rosenbaum was great. So his stuff about Huber and Gage Grosquit's statement that he was there to stop Huber from hurting Kyle Rittenhouse, fantastic. Be very interesting to see how that pans out as it's introduced. He managed to get the Rosenbaum not wanting to go back to jail or being okay with going back to jail, getting in there. Like he got that in, which will be an interesting perhaps segue into getting ultimately the reasons that Rosenbaum would have been at jail or at the mental hospital into the case in general. So the thing I said on Twitter was this: the prosecution had a better opening statement. I don't know how you could watch those two and say that the prosecution didn't. He just did a better job. It was more concise. It was easier to follow. But the defense has a better case, and they laid that case out really well in this opening statement, even if it took forever to do. So we'll see how that goes. But I think on opening statement judgment alone, prosecution's was better by far. What did you think?
Yeah, so I'll just preface this by saying because there was some speculation in the chat about my personal knowledge of the case. I'm fairly familiar with the case. I've covered it on my channel, and I've been on the view that Kyle Rittenhouse has a valid self-defense claim. I've said it many times that I think it's a valid self-defense claim. So I have to, but what I have to do when I'm analyzing this is I have to put myself in the position of the jury, because the jury is supposed to look at the evidence only from what's in court. So to the extent they know anything, they're supposed to disregard that and not only look at what's being presented before them. So I have to put myself in that position when I'm analyzing this. For me, I thought this opening was like a 3 out of 10, possibly 2 out of 10, where the prosecution was 9. There were just a multitude of problems that I wrote down. The biggest overall problem, there are two big overall problems. One was the run-on sentences. There's just sentences that went on forever and beginning new sentences with "and." The other big problem was he had no storytelling. He had no narrative architecture. This is what the prosecution did so well. They had a story, and they went through the story in a time sequence and with plot points and things that showed a direction and a narrative architecture. For me, the defense lawyer was presenting information, but there was no coherent or cohesive theme that was driving what he was saying. And also, unlike the prosecution statement felt like it was planned and rehearsed, and it didn't come off as rehearsed. What I mean by that is it seemed like something he had worked on and really gotten the wording down and gotten the timing down. It seemed like he could do it basically from memory. He had that statement down. The defense seemed like they were making it up on the fly. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's just the way it came off, or that he's just making things up. It didn't seem planned out. There was also this point from a technical aspect of the law where the chat has pointed out that he used the word victim, apparently more than once. So this is what shifted from a 3 out of 10 opening to a 2 out of 10 opening, because I didn't catch it anytime he said it. So I'll take the chat's word for it. But if he used the word victim in relation to these people, then the state has the argument of reopening that door. And so if they're now able to refer to these people as victims going forward, he sabotaged what was a major win for him. As a comment I made earlier, it's like, how do you make the videos and photographs of the thing boring? Because it was boring. It was, and he did get better at the end. I'll give him credit for that. He got better at the end, finished okay. But the first 30 minutes really were not good. So that's what I think. If you had to base it right now, you'd say that Kyle's going down in flames, which is not my preferred conclusion, but that's where I think, I thought it was pretty bad.
I disagree with the assessment that basing it on the opening statements would say Kyle's going down in flames. I think that the prosecution delivered a better opening statement, but I don't think it was a case-winning opening statement versus the defense's opening statement, personally. I think the defense, again, had a bloated opening statement, way too much extraneous stuff.
As long as shit. I forgot to mention that too. Oh God, yeah, it was long as hell.
Getting to the worst part for me was getting to it. That's what took so long. It's like, just get to the opening statement, please. Can we get to where your thing is? But he had too much of a lead up. But he did have some really good stuff in there, and some of those photos are fantastic. Photos from angles that I hadn't seen before, which is nice. I've watched a lot of the video, but they grabbed some really good still frames of the hand on the gun. They've got I don't think his showing of Grosskreutz advancing was a very good still frame.
Yeah,
that's weird because he's like, look at how he's closer. It's like, well, you picked a completely different angled image, so I don't know that that's super helpful, but yeah, and pointing out that Gage lied about having his firearm is an interesting sort of addition there as well. So it's and I think that's kind of important because Gage is going to be the one testifying, right? Like, the other two are dead, as the prosecution is very happy to say. They're dead, so they won't be testifying. Gage will, and he's already brought up credibility issues with Gage, and I think he's on the road. Although I think it's mostly Binger's fault to bring in Rosenbaum's criminal history. And someone pointed out to me, this is something I missed in the prosecution's opening statement, which I wish I would have caught it. The prosecution said that Huber was a good guy, which is quintessential character statement that can open you up to introducing.
If he said that, yeah, that would be, yeah.
And see, that's the hard thing. The stream is being wonky.
We can go back to full screen because there's nothing to watch for a while.
Yeah. I'm actually going to switch to, whoops. Wrecked. No, I'm actually going to switch to the Court TV feed.
Okay.
Instead, I've heard the Court TV has better.
And I'm not. Please understand, when I'm giving assessment, I'm basing it off of what has been said in court up to this point, because that's what the jury has to do. Where are we right now? So am I saying that Kyle is toast? When I said that, did I mean based on everything that will be admitted? No, I thought I was fairly clear, but I'll say it again. I was basing it based on what we know up to this point, because the jury at least is supposed to conceptually block everything out of their mind except what's been offered in court. So all the jury knows is the opening statements up to this point. So based on that, how would you rate it? And I was like, well, based on that, Kyle's toast, which was my assessment, although Nick disagrees. He thought it was stronger, which is a valid disagreement of opinion.
No, I didn't think the opening statement was stronger. I just think the case overall is stronger.
Yeah, so I wasn't speaking to the case overall. I was speaking to what we know so far.
Right.
So yeah, when the witnesses testify, and maybe if this guy's going to be doing the case principally, maybe he's a lot better at questioning than he is at opening statements. I mean, different lawyers have different strengths. So as the evidence gets revealed and as the witnesses testify, the case hopefully for Rittenhouse will be a lot stronger, because I continue to think, based on all the knowledge we have, that Rittenhouse is not guilty. So hopefully that will become manifest throughout the trial. And hopefully someone else closes, would be my thought. But the opening alone is not working great.
So it turns out the state's opening video on Court TV is 34 minutes, 22 seconds. So if that's the case...
How long did they say?
I clocked it at 40 minutes, almost to the minute. One thing to remember, if there's a place with various stereotypical accents, like the movie Fargo, for example, or just Mark Richards talking, it may be annoying or grating to hear a thick Wisconsin accent. To me, who's in Minnesota, thick Minnesota accents are different, but also grating. But I'm from Texas. Your You're not up in Wisconsin or Minnesota. So it may be annoying to us, but to the people that are sitting there in the jury box, most of them, if they don't talk like that, you know, their dad does, their uncle does, their brother does, their mechanic, their priest, whatever. These people are used to these kinds of accents. So he's got that, like, it's like a weird mix of Chicago and Wisconsin thrown together. And so it's an annoying thing, and he sounds really weird, and he draws out his words, and he starts every sentence with "and." But I think those affectations are probably pretty normal for the people who are sitting in the jury box.
Maybe that's fair. Maybe they will respond to that more based on their local, you know, dialects and patterns. That's a fair point. That the things on the skateboard are called trucks. I get it. I understand. But the jury doesn't understand, so it's probably ill-advised to use the word trucks. It's correct in a technical sense.
Just say the wheels or the axles.
Just call them the wheels, or the axle would have been fine. So that stuff. So I've been successfully vamping for a couple minutes now, but I could go more.
I got to get a bunch of super chats that I want to get to that I've been putting off because the court was talking. The one thing on the trucks aspect, I think you say wheels or axles in opening statement. And then I think when you're presenting evidence about the skateboard itself, you talk about the trucks, you get one out there. You bring an example of one to the court, and you say, look at this. This is a hunk of metal that's attached to the skateboard. If you're hitting someone with this, it's adding weight. You might strike them with the metal. I mean, these are real dangerous things. And you bring that in. I agree. I think for opening statements, it should have just been a quick thing. I also do love, this is my favorite part of the opening statement, I have decided, was him saying that Huber was trying to literally decapitate Kyle with his skateboard. That was magnificent.
It was it was
remove his head from his shoulders.
I appreciate that. That was a good flavor text.
I liked it.